International news now.
So we want to begin the discussion about the first week of Trump's foreign policy with his first presidential act, and that's his inauguration speech. It identified a series of policy goals and challenges and presented a narrative about the specific historic moment in which the United States now finds itself. Trump returned to many of the themes we saw in his first inauguration speech in 2017. It again relied on the concept of America First, which is a loose collection of national goals focused on political, social, and economic outcomes at home, domestically, and a critique of America's position or standing in the world. Trump declared that from this moment on, America's decline is over. He criticized prior administrations for their neglect of the domestic costs and consequences of U.S. foreign policies, and he promised to rebalance and prioritize domestic goals over foreign ones. He pledged to make dramatic changes in immigration policy and how the southern border of the United States was policed. So we are now going to play 6 clips from the inauguration speech and that have relevance for U.S. foreign policy. The first 2 provide an overview of the broad interests that the Trump administration will pursue. And the remaining 4 focus respectively on specific issues: the border, energy, trade, and that new one, territorial expansion. So let's go ahead and roll the first clip.
The golden age of America begins right now. From this day forward, our country will flourish and be respected again all over the world. We will be the envy of every nation, and we will not allow ourselves to be taken advantage of any longer. During every single day of the Trump administration, I will very simply put America first. Our sovereignty will be reclaimed. Our safety will be restored. The scales of justice will be rebalanced. The vicious, violent, and unfair weaponization of the Justice Department and our government will end. And our top priority will be to create a nation that is proud, prosperous, and free. America will soon be greater, stronger, and far more exceptional than ever before.
Okay, I want to highlight a few themes and passages here. We see his overarching goal of America First, and we see this couched in what we might think of as a trend in global positionality. He argues that the U.S. has long been taken advantage of, so that must stop. The United States should be envied, and it will be stronger than ever before. It is, in these words, this is a description of relative strength, which implies a comparison with all other states in the world. Accordingly, we can view this opening portion of his speech as reflecting nationalist goals that will elevate the United States over other states. So we're going to run the second clip now, and I want you to think about something I noticed in this speech, the fusion of domestic and foreign policy priorities as though they are 2 sides of the same coin. Note that Trump will couple a domestic bad with a policy critique of a foreign bad. He's going to link these 2 together. So let's go ahead and run that second clip.
But first, we must be honest about the challenges we face. While they are plentiful, they will be annihilated by this great momentum that the world is now witnessing in the United States of America. As we gather today, our government confronts a crisis of trust. For many years, a radical and corrupt establishment has extracted power and wealth from our citizens while the pillars of our society lay broken and seemingly in complete disrepair. We now have a government that cannot manage even a simple crisis at home. while at the same time stumbling into a continuing catalog of catastrophic events abroad. It fails to protect our magnificent, law-abiding American citizens, but provides sanctuary and protection for dangerous criminals, many from prisons and mental institutions that have illegally entered our country from all over the world. We have a government that has given unlimited funding to the defense of foreign borders, but refuses to defend American borders or, more importantly, its own people.
Okay, I just want to emphasize the connections here that he draws between domestic challenges and foreign policy commitments or policies in this part of the speech. Trump does this at least 3 times while indirectly critiquing prior administrations, which presumably really means the Biden administration. He says that the government cannot manage crises at home while stumbling into catastrophes abroad. He says that the government has failed to protect U.S. citizens while providing sanctuary for criminals that have illegally entered the United States. And he argues that prior administrations have failed to defend American borders while providing aid for foreign governments to defend their own borders. Now, we can think about all these claims as illustrating a much broader critique of internationalist grand strategies that focuses on the political and economic costs of U.S. global commitments. Now let's move on to the third clip. It presents the initial action items that President Trump will pursue. And it is important to note where he starts with the related needs to tighten the policing of the U.S. southern border while dramatically reducing immigration into the United States. So let's run that clip now.
Today, I will sign a series of historic executive orders. With these actions, we will begin the complete restoration of America and the revolution of common sense. It's all about common sense. First, I will declare a national emergency at our southern border. All illegal entry will immediately be halted, and we will begin the process of returning millions and millions of criminal aliens back to the places from which they came. We will reinstate my Remain in Mexico policy. I will end the practice of catch and release. And I will send troops to the southern border to repel the disastrous invasion of our country. Under the orders I signed today, we will also be designating the cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. And by invoking the Alien Enemies Act of 1798, I will direct our government to use the full and immense power of federal and state law enforcement to eliminate the presence of all foreign gangs and criminal networks, bringing devastating crime to U.S. soil, including our cities and inner cities.
So this section of the speech signals the policy priorities of the Trump administration by highlighting the first and presumably most important executive orders that Trump will sign later that afternoon. The first batch here is all organized around dramatically tightening the enforcement of border restrictions to limit immigration to the United States and to reduce transnational criminal activities, particularly those associated with drug and human trafficking. Trump issued a national emergency at the border. This appears to be principally designed to create a legal foundation to deploy Defense Department resources to the border, including U.S. military forces, so they can augment the budgetary resources that are already used there by the Department of Homeland Security. Memos have been leaked this week that indicate that President Trump plans to deploy 10,000 active duty military personnel to the southern border. As of Friday morning, these orders haven't been given yet. These are just memos that have been leaked. He has also ordered the construction of new physical barriers along the southern border, presumably with Defense Department resources, as he did in his first term.
Now, Trump also promised to enact a series of policies that were designed to reduce sharply the immigration at the southern border and deport large numbers of people that are currently in the United States. The administration plans to scale up the deportation of immigrants with undocumented legal status. And the Trump administration promises to halt the catch and release program, whereby it will no longer grant individuals requesting asylum some form of temporary residency status in the United States while their claims are adjudicated. Instead, people requesting political asylum must now remain in Mexico while their claims are processed through immigration courts. Trump also signed an executive order that indefinitely halted the resettling of refugees into the United States. During the presidential campaign, we heard prominent stories about refugees like those from Haiti and Springfield, Illinois, for example, during the debate. Ohio. Yeah. Sorry, thank you. This executive order halts further admission of people fleeing war zones, for example, into the United States. He also ordered the State Department to begin the administrative process of designating drug cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. The administration will couple this official designation with the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 to claim broad authority to deport any non-citizen with ties to a foreign gang or drug cartel. So that's a whole raft of different orders and policies from day one to severely stop the flow of immigrants into the United States from the southern border. So now let's move on to a fourth clip that looks at another policy, energy policy, and calls for the United States to, in the words of the president, drill, baby, drill. So let's run that clip now.
Next, I will direct all members of my cabinet to marshal the vast powers at their disposal to defeat what was record inflation and rapidly bring down costs and prices. The inflation crisis was caused by massive overspending and escalating energy prices, and that is why today I will also declare a national energy emergency. We will drill, baby, drill. America will be a manufacturing nation once again, and we have something that no other manufacturing nation will ever have, the largest amount of oil and gas of any country on earth, and we are going to use it. We will bring prices down, fill our strategic reserves up again, right to the top, and export American energy all over the world. We will be a rich nation again, and it is that liquid gold under our feet that will help to do it. With my actions today, we will end the Green New Deal, and we will revoke the electric vehicle mandate, saving our auto industry and keeping my sacred pledge to our great American auto workers.
Again, we see here an important coupling of domestic and foreign issues. He identifies inflation as the problem to be addressed, and the solution is the dramatic expansion of fossil fuels production in the United States. This will drive down energy prices inside the United States and increase energy exports, both of which will help increase national income. He then matches these energy policies with a sharp critique of prior U.S. policies to increase investment in alternative energy sources, namely electric automobiles. As we will discuss in the second part of this lecture, these energy policies have another important implication for international agreements that are designed to reduce carbon emissions that cause climate change. Quite simply, President Trump opposes the primary one, the Paris Climate Accord, and he signed an executive order to withdraw the United States from it on Inauguration Day. So in our next segment, we want to examine trade policies and the threatened tariffs associated with them. So let's go ahead and run that clip.
I will immediately begin the overhaul of our trade system to protect American workers and families. Instead of taxing our citizens to enrich other countries, we will tariff and tax foreign countries to enrich our citizens. For this purpose, we are establishing the External Revenue Service to collect all tariffs, duties, and revenues. It will be massive amounts of money pouring into our treasury, coming from foreign sources.
A few brief notes here on trade policy. First, there was a little mismatch here between what Trump had promised to do on tariffs and trade policy during the transition and what he actually did on Inauguration Day. So during the campaign, Trump had pledged to increase tariffs significantly on the three largest sources of imports into the United States: China, Canada, and Mexico. Those tariff increases have not been implemented yet, although there has been some chatter this week that they will go into effect shortly, sometime in February. So they're probably coming. Instead, Trump issued a memorandum directing the Secretary of Commerce, the Secretary of the Treasury, and the U.S. Trade Representative to study, quote, the causes of our country's large and persistent annual trade deficits in goods, as well as the economic and national security implications and risks resulting from such deficits, and recommend appropriate measures, such as a global supplemental tariff or other policies to remedy those deficits. So, there will be a little pause here before the implementation of some trade policy revisions. The general expectation is that tariffs will go up, and those higher tariffs should work to decrease imports into the United States. That's how tariffs work, and that's the central, incentive to have tariffs, right? As a brief aside, let's be clear. Tariffs are taxes imposed by the federal government on goods that are imported into the United States. These taxes are generally assigned or charged when the good crosses U.S. borders, say at a port of entry. The tariffs are usually paid by the firm or individual taking possession of the product on the U.S. side of the border. President Trump frequently talks as if foreigners, pay all the costs associated with tariffs. The reinforcement of this narrative is also part of the reason why he wants to create a so-called external revenue service to collect tariffs, as opposed to the internal revenue service that collects income taxes, for example, right? So this external revenue service creates a frame that says, foreign actors are paying all these tariffs. This is a pretty significant mischaracterization of how the costs of tariffs are distributed. And it's important to know this, and it'll become clearer as these things get enacted. Generally, the costs of tariffs fall at least partly or even primarily on final consumers. When an importer is charged a tariff by the government, it increases their cost of doing business or of selling that product in the United States. Frequently, those importing or retail firms just then pass the cost of the tax, the tariff, onto their final consumers through higher prices. As a result, higher tariffs are also generally associated with higher consumer prices. And remember, one of the biggest domestic bads we were referring to was inflation. That was one of the primary, issues that harmed the Biden administration and Kamala Harris as the successor of that during the campaign. So this is going to be a key point.
Can I just add one brief aside here too? For those of you who are interested in what's happening with stock market prices, stock market prices have been fluctuating significantly over the last 3 months, basically around what's happening to interest rates, and interest rates are getting set by inflation expectations. One of the concerns that markets are watching is what tariff increases will do to inflation. And so there's going to be a connection here. Watch how markets are responding. When I say markets, I mean equity markets, stocks, the Dow Jones Industrial Average, the S&P 500. Watch how they respond to tariff announcements, right? Because the big concern here is, will these tariffs increase or reaccelerate inflation in the United States?
If they're inflationary, then, the way that you try to curb inflation is to...
Yeah, and then this is ultimately could then, right, because if they kick off inflation, this could put more pressure on on the Federal Reserve to raise interest rates.
Exactly.
And interestingly, at Davos yesterday, President Trump said he's going to tell the Federal Reserve that they have to cut interest rates, which will create another policy challenge because the Fed gets to set monetary policy independently. Of political officials. Anyway.
Now, before we end on tariffs, let's make one final point. These trade policy changes are consistent with a long-standing policy goal of the Trump administration. He wants to redirect or redistribute wealth away from foreign actors and toward U.S. citizens. And he argues that this redistribution can occur by protecting U.S. manufacturing jobs or by reducing foreign aid. He also wants to argue that tariffs will redistribute wealth back to Americans. However, tariffs generally can't do that if they raise final consumer prices. And this is what happens when foreign exporters, importing wholesalers or retailers, just pass the cost of those higher tariffs, which are taxes to the federal government, on to their final consumers. And so the one way to think about this is that tariffs can produce certain outcomes that we might find attractive, and especially certain sectors of the country find attractive, protecting U.S. domestic policy. But if it's at the cost of inflation, it's sort of paid for by consumers through higher prices, then suddenly that deal doesn't seem nearly as attractive, right? So let's move on to the last segment we're going to discuss from the inauguration speech. And I have to admit, this is a surprise to all of us, as we already said. That issue is territorial expansion of the United States. So let's roll the clip.
America will reclaim its rightful place as the greatest, most powerful, most respected nation on earth, inspiring the awe and admiration of the entire world. A short time from now, we are going to be changing the name of the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America, and we will restore the name of a great president, William McKinley, to Mount McKinley, where it should be and where it belongs. President McKinley made our country very rich through tariffs and through talent. He was a natural businessman and gave Teddy Roosevelt the money for many of the great things he did, including the Panama Canal, which has foolishly been given to the country of Panama after the United States. The United States, think of this, spent more money than ever spent on a project before and lost 38,000 lives in the building of the Panama Canal. We have been treated very badly from this foolish gift that should have never been made, and Panama's promise to us has been broken. The purpose of our deal and the spirit of our treaty has been totally violated. American ships are being severely overcharged and not treated fairly in any way, shape, or form, and that includes the United States Navy. And above all, China is operating the Panama Canal, and we didn't give it to China, we gave it to Panama, and we're taking it back. Above all, my message to Americans today is that it is time for us to once again act with courage, vigor, and the vitality of history's greatest civilization. So as we liberate our nation, we will lead it to new heights of victory and success. We will not be deterred. Together we will end the chronic disease epidemic and keep our children safe, healthy, and disease-free. The United States will once again consider itself a growing nation, one that increases our wealth, expands our territory, builds our cities, raises our expectations, and carries our flag into new and beautiful horizons. And we will pursue our manifest destiny into the stars, launching American astronauts to plant the stars and stripes on the planet Mars.
So I have to admit that I was most surprised by this section of the speech, particularly a single sentence or clause within it that has received very little attention, as the news media has largely been focused on immigration policy. But that sentence reflects a significant break in U.S. foreign policy in a direction that's very inconsistent with the isolationist tendencies of the first term of the Trump administration, and perhaps even more ambitious than the primacy of George W. Bush that sought to use U.S. military power to remake the Middle East. But more on that in a second. So let's continue this buildup by highlighting the message at the outset of the clip. Trump begins with a nationalist reclamation of American greatness and power. Quote, America will reclaim its rightful place as the greatest, most powerful, most respected nation on earth, inspiring the awe and admiration of the entire world, unquote. He then declares that he will rename the Gulf of Mexico as the Gulf of America. And he celebrates President McKinley, arguing that he successfully used tariffs to increase the wealth of the United States. But the discussion of McKinley is also, apart from renaming the mountain in Alaska, is also a rhetorical vehicle to launch an even bolder policy goal. President Trump committed on Monday to retaking possession of the Panama Canal from Panama. So let's be clear here of the legal implications of this. This action would violate the territorial rights and sovereignty of Panama, an independent state recognized by the United States and the United Nations. During the speech, President Trump also evokes the mantle of manifest destiny that was used to justify the Western territorial expansion of the United States in the 19th century. Most importantly, President Trump explicitly pledges the United States government to a program of territorial expansion. He stated, quote, the United States will once again consider itself a growing nation, one that increases our wealth, expands our territory, builds our cities, raises our expectations, and carries our flag into new and beautiful horizons, end quote. So this reflects an important break in U.S. foreign policy. The U.S. has explicitly avoided territorial expansion since at least the end of World War II. Restoring, for example, the national sovereignty of Japan, Germany, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan after deploying U.S. troops for extended conflicts there. Even President George W. Bush, during the most recent war in Iraq, very explicitly committed that the United States would not seize and hold territory there, that the U.S. had always intended to restore Iraqi sovereignty and go home. And in this way, the first week of version 2.0 of the Trump administration looks very different from the first term.
Yeah. Okay, in the next segment of our news session, we want to provide a quick overview of prominent executive orders signed by President Trump in the last week that have implication for foreign policy. And with one exception, we are going to push what will be an extended discussion of immigration policy to a future news segment. So we're not going to cover all of the executive orders surrounding immigration. There were a lot of them. and we'll do that in a future discussion. Instead, we will highlight 3 sets of executive orders on prominent multilateral global agreements on public health, on climate change, and on corporate tax policy. President Trump announced that he is withdrawing the United States from each of these sets of agreements. Again, this is a significant break from a long tradition of U.S. participation in multilateral cooperative agreements since the end of World War II. Before discussing the content of these orders, we want to briefly discuss the legal and administrative functions of executive orders. We want to tell you a bit about how they work. Executive orders are presidential directives that provide guidance on how U.S. laws should be interpreted and implemented by officials of the U.S. government, particularly those under the authority of the president within the executive branch. Accordingly, they don't officially make new laws, but they tell government officials how existing laws should be interpreted and followed. These interpretations are subject to legal challenge through the judicial process, which can ultimately wind its way up all the way to the Supreme Court. And such challenges can delay implementation of these executive orders.
And just as a means of background here, one of President Trump's executive orders on birthright citizenship was challenged legally on the very first day of the inauguration, and a judge, I believe in Washington, has already halted the implementation of it. So we're going to see this judicial process play out over many of these executive orders. Now, presidential authority to issue executive orders is rooted in Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution, which simply states the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America. While executive orders do not officially create new laws, they have the effects of law. They're issued in relation to a law passed by Congress, or they may claim authority granted to the president through the Constitution. Accordingly, these orders do not require additional congressional approval, and they can't be directly overturned by lawmakers unless they secure approval for a superseding law, which is also then needs presidential approval. Because of this insulation, executive orders are also used by presidents to pursue policies for which they often cannot secure congressional approval. That said, Congress could still try to block an executive order from being effective by removing funding that the executive orders need. Additionally, it's important to recognize that executive orders cannot replace or override statutes enacted by Congress.
So we should be clear that all presidents use executive orders. This is not an invention by the Trump administration. The Obama administration famously established DACA and other immigration policies through executive orders and things like that.
And we should also note, and we'll talk about this in upcoming modules as well, is that presidents, as part of this long-term battle between the president and the legislative branch over the implementation of foreign policy, we've seen presidents in the last 15 to 20 years rely increasingly on executive orders to implement international agreements with other states because it's so hard to get 2/3 approval, or basically impossible now, 2/3 approval from the Senate. And so we see lots of international agreements that are made and implemented through executive orders, but that also leads them to being vulnerable of the U.S. withdrawing from when the presidential administration changes.
And that's where you get this in and out business, like we were in the Paris Climate Accords under Obama, get pulled out by Trump, back in by Biden, now pulled out by Trump again. Yeah. So that's a problem. So, okay, so let's look now at some of the specific executive orders from the last week that reflect significant changes in U.S. foreign policy. On Monday, January 20th, President Trump issued an executive order to withdraw the U.S. from the World Health Organization, the WHO, for a second time. Trump had originally began the withdrawal of the United States from the WHO on July 6, 2020. President Biden, having been elected in the fall of 2020, retracted that withdrawal on January 21st, 2021. So President Trump revoked Biden's executive order that restored U.S. membership to instead complete the U.S. withdrawal, just like we were saying, in and out, right? The WHO is the United Nations specialized public health agency that coordinates multilateral responses to global health threats like the outbreaks of Mpox, Ebola, COVID-19, polio. It also provides technical assistance to poorer countries, helps distribute scarce vaccines, it supplies, other supplies and treatments. It sets guidelines for hundreds of health conditions, including mental health and cancer. During the COVID era, President Trump criticized this organization for being too slow to respond to the pandemic and being, quote, owned and controlled by China. The executive order on Monday said the U.S. was withdrawing from the WHO due to the organization's mishandling of the COVID-19 pandemic that arose out of Wuhan, China, and other global health crises, and cited the agency's failure to adopt urgently needed reforms and its inability to demonstrate independence from the inappropriate political influence of WHO member states. The withdrawal of the United States will create significant budgetary challenges for the WHO because the United States contributed 18% of the WHO's budget in 2023. Critics of this decision worry that the U.S. will lose easy access to critical data on disease outbreaks, and it will lose a seat at the table when health standards are set. They also worry that the U.S. government will struggle to protect Americans in the next pandemic or from other foreign diseases. This withdrawal is also likely to give China additional power within the WHO, including the power to shape the historic pandemic agreement now in the final stages of negotiation.
So President Trump also signed an executive order on Monday directing the United States to again withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement. While not a legally binding treaty, the Paris Accord is a multilateral agreement designed to limit carbon emissions and limit global warming. The executive order states that the Paris Accord does not reflect U.S. values and, quote, steers American taxpayer dollars to countries that do not require or merit financial assistance in the interests of the American people. The executive order also claims that the U.S. has simultaneously grown its economy, raised worker wages, increased energy production, reduced air and water pollution, and reduced greenhouse gas emissions over decades. And its successful track record of advancing both economic and environmental objectives should be a model for other countries. So while this withdrawal process will take a year to complete, the U.S. will join Iran, Yemen, and Libya as the only other countries to currently stand outside of the agreement. And Trump's previous withdrawal in 2017 took effect the day after the 2020 presidential election because of the Accord's initial 3-year commitment, but was promptly reversed on President Biden's first day in office. The current executive order is consistent with the national energy emergency announced by the White House and a raft of changes that will reverse U.S. climate regulations and boost oil and gas production in the United States. President Trump also said he would cancel efforts, as we already noted, to increase production and sales of electric vehicles.
So President Trump also issued a memorandum to the Treasury Secretary that effectively withdrew the United States from an international tax agreement that established a global minimum corporate tax of 15%. This agreement, which was originally negotiated by the Biden administration in 2021 and signed by 140 countries, so virtually every country in the world, was designed to prevent multinational companies from moving their headquarters or accounting offices to a country with the lowest corporate tax rates for the purpose of avoiding corporate tax payments. The memorandum declared the OECD global tax deal, quote, not only allows extraterritorial jurisdiction over American income, but also limits our nation's ability to enact tax policies that serve the interests of American businesses and workers. Now, most importantly, this executive order illustrates the consistent resistance to multilateral agreements that attempt to contain or limit some of the externalities associated with globalization. President Trump made a point, it seems, to withdraw the United States from as many international multilateral agreements as he could. That's part of his agenda.
Yeah.
And
as just as a quick aside, let me give you I want to give you a little bit more background on how this tax agreement would have worked. So imagine a big corporation like Apple, and recognize they have operations all throughout the world. They're in India, they're in Taiwan, they're in China, they have
States, Europe.
They've got subcontractors in the United States and Europe. What these multinational corporations can do through accounting devices and say, well, we incurred all these costs in China and Taiwan, and we incurred all kinds of costs in the United States. And so we didn't turn any profits in the United States. Instead, all of our profits miraculously showed up in the Cayman Islands.
Right.
Because this is where, the key value added of the firm is, because there are some HR people there or some financial people there. And so we're going to claim, for the purposes of corporate taxes in the United States, we're going to claim all of our profits in the Cayman Islands, and they have a 5% corporate tax rate, where the United States has a 22% corporate tax rate. So we are only responsible for paying 5% on our profits this year. That's what multinational firms can do when they engage in operations in all these countries. They can claim profits in the lowest tax environment. This global corporate tax minimum was an international agreement that was designed to prevent that, by getting all the countries to the agreement to basically say, all right, we're all going to have at least a corporate tax minimum of 15%, and that will deter or eliminate the incentives for Apple to say that its profits are in some tax haven rather than made in the United States.
I mean, the bad that it's trying to correct is this taking advantage of states like the United States by these large multinational corporations, right? And
it was designed to enhance the tax enforcement capacity of the U.S. government by creating an international agreement. And, well,
we're not in it now.
We're not going to worry about that now. So, all right, so let's step back a bit and try to identify some general foreign policy trends in this version 2.0 of President Trump. You want to go first, or you want me to go first?
You know what? I could go first.
All right, go ahead.
So let me make 2 points, and then you've got more points, I think, to make. The first thing is I was struck by a strategy, I would call it, of frenetic energy. I mean, this president and this administration is arguably starting off strong with a lot of initiatives, a lot of action on day one. He promised that, and he's delivering that, and I think he's doing that for a variety of reasons. You'll talk about a strategy like this flood the zone strategy, and I'll leave that to you, in a way to overwhelm opposition. But I'm going to say that there's also a strategy here that President Trump wants to sort of demonstrate, especially when it comes to immigration and the border, what it looks like to take decisive action on border security. I mean, Republicans during the Biden administration consistently and strongly criticized the Biden administration, saying, look, if you really wanted to control the surge of migrant crossings across the southern border, you could have taken actions, and you didn't. Right? And I would say that this frenetic energy and activity around the immigration is in part designed to show the American people that he is dedicated, serious, and determined to bring this particular issue under control. And that's meant as not only just a promise kept, but also a distinction between his administration and the previous administration. And it goes back to something we talked about in an earlier version of the class, because the Biden administration tried to do a bipartisan legislation to bring down immigrant crossings, and then candidate Trump killed that by telling the Republicans not to sign on that. And it's pretty clear now that he was serious about killing that legislation, not just so the Biden administration doesn't get a win there, but also because he was going to adopt an even more aggressive policy, and that's what he's doing now. So that's the first point I would say, is that was striking to me. The second one is sort of a contrast here, and that is that there's a lot of activity going on, but what I was struck was the relative inattention to two huge conflicts that dominated U.S. foreign policy in the Biden administration: the conflict in Ukraine and the conflict in the United States. In the Middle East. Those two conflicts, it's not that President Trump hasn't said anything about that or hasn't promised and to take action on those things, but compared to immigration or energy or trade, in the inauguration speech, those conflicts received a lot less attention. And it'll be interesting for me, especially I've got a specific interest in the Ukraine conflict because of my specialization on Russian politics, is to see how the Trump administration navigates when those issues come on the agenda. How is he going to address those things and then pay attention to those while at the same time maintaining any momentum and any attention to those other big issues about immigration, energy, tariffs, and trade. It's going, even for him, it's going to be harder to keep all of these balls in the air, I would say. So those are my two big things.
So a couple things, let me just talk. I agree completely that we see his priorities here: immigration.
Yeah.
And some of the closest and well-connected reporters in the Trump orbit, they were saying this during the transition. If you want to talk about his priorities, everything starts and ends with immigration and the border. And so in that sense, what we're seeing is not surprising, but you're right, the way that it's overwhelming other big foreign policy issues like the Middle East and Ukraine is significant. There was a little nugget I forgot to talk about in another executive order that was signed on Monday that has implications for Ukraine. Trump ordered an immediate halt, and I can't remember if it was for 90 days or 120 days, 90 days on all foreign aid spending. This has big implications for Ukraine. He essentially turned that off. Any money that hadn't been shipped prior to January 20th, there's a pause, which enhances his leverage over how the war is going to be fought, at least over the next 3 months.
At the same time, the few comments he's made have been pretty critical of Russia and Vladimir Putin.
Yes.
And so it's going to be, that will be an interesting dynamic to watch how he promised to end the conflict on day one. It'll be interesting to see how he's going to try to negotiate and end a ceasefire in there.
And in one, I think it was last week or maybe the week before in one of the pressers. So Trump will come out and give a press conference, and then he'll talk with reporters and they'll throw questions at. And I remember in one of these, he was asked a question about sanctions on Russia, and he effectively said, well, I think sanctions are going to go up. And so this is another little surprise. In a sense, he's signaling a slightly different direction and orientation towards Putin specifically than he was, say, in the first term. Again, we're very early on. We'll see what happens.
He said the words that Putin is ruining Russia through the war in Ukraine. I mean, he didn't talk like that about Putin before. So it'll be interesting to watch that.
The other thing, so let me build on what Professor Moser said about frenetic energy and the pace of change. This is also a stated political strategy of implementation that's being pursued by Trump's advisors. In particular, I think he's the Deputy Chief of Staff, Steve Miller, who plays the key role on immigration in the administration. He's been a close Trump advisor since early on in his first term. Gave an extensive interview a few months ago where he said, one of the big lessons we learned in the first Trump administration in terms of getting what we want is we're going to engage and flood the zone. What this effectively means is we are going to spit out so many policy changes and so many actions and so many statements that we are going to intentionally overwhelm the ability of the political resistance and political opposition and the news media in the United States to track everything we're doing. Right. We're going to overwhelm the opposition. They get tired of it. So we can get some of the things we want. And so it's no coincidence that we see this huge explosion of executive orders, that the media is struggling to follow these things. We talked about here, the media is focused on immigration, and yet we have a significant change in policy with respect to Panama. And, and a U.S. president saying that we're going to take the Panama Canal back, and everybody in the audience stand up and applaud it. Oh, and incidentally, guess where our Secretary of State's first foreign visit is going to be?
Panama.
To Panama. Right? He was confirmed on Monday, and on Wednesday he makes the announcement he's going to Panama. Right. So this isn't, it doesn't look like talk to me. This looks pretty significant. But what's important here is that's a political strategy about managing opposition in the United States and about trying to overwhelm them with the assumption that voters and media outlets have limited attention spans. Something else we want to emphasize, we already talked about, is there's a clear resistance to internationalism here, and there's a broader political claim that international agreements are bad for the United States, and so we're just going to pull out of them. And that simultaneously is a critique of one of the motivating reasons behind these international agreements, is there are externalities associated with globalization and international politics. And these international agreements are designed to minimize the externalities, minimize the costs. Climate change is a perfect example of this. The U.S. can't solve the problem of climate change on its own by reducing carbon emissions in the United States. It needs cooperation from other countries because we have one atmosphere, right? And so we aren't
one country's not going to fix it. Yeah. Even a big, powerful country like the United States, if China doesn't go too, it's over.
So the larger point is you need multilateral cooperation to deal with these externalities, and Trump is embracing a foreign policy view that that's not the case. I'm trying to think if we talked about this fusion of domestic and foreign policy goals, and this has consistently been a part of his political strategy, which is I'm going to blame international actors and agreements that the United States has made with other states. I'm going to say those are the sources of political problems, but those identification of those problems then become a ready-made set of policy solutions and way to address American challenges at home. And so there's this coupling that's really important, and we see this in the immigration debate. Problems of crime in the United States are attributable to immigration. So how do we solve the problem of crime? We solve it by choking off our border and preventing people from coming in the United States. So watch this coupling in terms of the conversations between domestic and foreign policies in the United States. So I think this is a pretty good start in terms of we understand. Sorry, were you going to jump?
Well, there's one other thing I would say is that, and again, just to kind of give some context here, every presidential administration tries to start off strong. Yeah. And this is a particularly ambitious administration. But one thing to always realize is that every administration has a clock ticking for after they get inaugurated, because the midterm elections are 2 years away, and they can result in divided government that then chokes off their options, right? But right now, the Trump administration has unified government, and they're going to try to get as many things done now before that might change in a very short period of time. And so there's broader institutional reasons for this kind of strategy as well. The flood the zone strategy, you're right, is trying to overwhelm opposition, but it's also just trying to beat the clock, because a midterm election, depending on how all these policies shake out, or whatever international or domestic crisis crops up in the next 2 years, there's going to be a midterm election, and there'll be another judgment. And that the last midterm election for the Trump administration created a divided government that then started to make it a lot harder. So,
and we should note one other thing here, right, in terms of the difference between the start of the Trump administration in 2017 and in 2025. It's clear, and there have been lots of conversation about it, they learned their mistakes, they were surprised with victory in November in 2016, and so the transition process was slow, it was haphazard, and they had to rely on existing Republican policymaking circles to staff their government. In the interim 8 years, Trump remade the Republican Party, and he's had a government in waiting since he left office in January of 2021. They were prepared for this transition, particularly in the case of immigration policy. They've been studying this for 2 or 3 years. They had a plan to hit the ground running on day one, and we see lots of evidence that that's what occurred.
And the
in the first
politics around immigration has changed too.
Yep.
And so there's a lot more support for that plan than 8 years ago.
Yep.
And we have to keep that in mind.
Yep.
You know, if you look at the polls,
Yes. No, the American public has moved
shifted
significantly. And one of the things that we'll talk about, and this came up in that daily podcast that I mentioned to you earlier, is the Biden administration. Part of the fallout and the discussion of these policies is there were some significant changes in immigration policy that the Biden administration made, and they did a bad job communicating those changes to the American public.
and they were slow.
And as a result, this helped create some of the momentum for doing more to tighten up the border in the Trump administration. It was important to his reelection. Okay, so I think this is a pretty good start for now. We recognize, in terms of trying to give you some sense of what's going on in Washington, D.C. and the world, and how the election of President Trump is going to change U.S. foreign policy. Again, we're going to hang on most of this, and we're going to talk about a lot of this during the term. We understand we've thrown a lot at you today. If you have questions, send us emails. We'll integrate them into our next lecture segment. Otherwise, we'll see you in the news segment.
There you go.